you will need a goal. The Pikachu toy is going to have to do something for it to be a game. Also, you will need an obstacle. It can't just be A, B, go to goal. You need something that stops you from getting immediately to that goal. And then you also need ways to make decisions in order to bypass those obstacles in order to reach that goal. And also, you would need rules. So you would need ways to interact with the system in order to make decisions and reach the goal. These are the 4 basic elements of games. So goals, obstacles, decisions, and rules. It doesn't need to have much more than that, but of course it can have a lot of other things. So those are the game elements. So what is actually game design though? Game design is a lot of things. You don't need to read this whole screen. I just put it here just to show how it can be a lot of things. And many of those things some people would not necessarily say is game design, like writing texts in many games. It might be actually a writer's purview, but like setting game rules, designing mechanics, how does the player interact with your game, designing the levels in which setting the player interacts with your game, content like which tools, which weapons, which plants and trees are in your game, coming up with what is needed in the user interface so that the player can interact with your game more fully, designing the progression, scripting, writing documentation, aligning the team members around a game vision, and making sure that the player gets the intended experience. Design is coming up with a lot of details, but in its core, I would say that it's problem solving the player's experience. So you have an idea of an intended experience that you want the player to have, and the game design is the choices that you and the team make in order to deliver that experience to the player. I'm going to structure this talk in 3 different parts. The first one is going to be the designer, the person, the designer. The second is going to be the process of game design. And the third is going to be the experience. So that player experience, the game and the player. First of all, the designer. The designer, first of all, is not the person that sits around thinking and having ideas. Ideas person is not a job in a game team. Thinking is something that everyone does. What the game designer does is they are responsible for that game design, for the problem solving of the player experience, for the choices that the team must make in order to deliver that experience. Now, a game designer can do many things depending on the size of your team. For example, you can have a creative designer, a technical designer, level designer, narrative designer, content, systems, UX. Some of these players might say is not really, not players, people might say is not really a game designer, but it falls into designer at least. But when you have a small team, when you have a hackathon team, or when you just have for example, in my team at Supercell, a lot of times you just have the game designer. I am the game designer on my team. There is no one else doing any design. So what the game designer needs to be, the main skills that I would say that a game designer needs to have is they need to be detail-oriented, very focused on the small things. They need to be a problem solver. So game design, like I said, is a lot about problem solving for that player experience, is like finding the best way to give the player what you want them to feel and to experience. You also need to have a high empathy and understand people, because again, to know how to make people feel a certain way and know how to make the best mechanics so that the person understands, you need to understand how the person thinks and understands the game. You also need to be very curious about the world, about everything, just a curious person. And you have to be very strong in communication. So both written and verbal communication. And when I say communication, I don't necessarily mean writing lengthy documents or explaining very complex things. I mean like knowing how to use language in order to make people understand what you mean. Now, again, The designer is the person responsible for the design. They are not the sole person and the design is their baby and only they can touch the design. That is not the case. This is not how a designer should be. What a designer should be is the person who knows what's happening in the design, like keeps everything stored in a file, knows where the things are and what things were decided, and takes all those ideas from other people in order to make the best game as possible. Because here's the thing, you are one person, let's say you, a designer, you are one person, and you can think many great things. But when you have 5 other people, they can think even more great things. And if you outsource that thinking and that designing, you can come up with a lot of great ideas really quickly. And it's your job as a designer to think about how the ideas fit the big picture. Do they fit the big picture? Do they not? It's your job to be open to receive ideas from your team members. And also it's your job to explain why an idea might not work in a way that does not stop them from coming to you again in the future. So you can't just be, no, hate your idea, it's not going to happen, because then you just cut off that potential source for future ideas, right? And everyone in your team is trying to make the best game. No, probably no one is there just because. They want to make a good game, they want to contribute to a great project. So you as a game designer, you need to find the best ideas and you need to make sure that they get to you. Now, there is this saying in Portuguese that a dog with 2 owners starves. And what that means is basically that if multiple people are responsible for the same thing, that thing won't get done properly. For example, if 5 different people are involved in documenting design, there are some things that everyone's going to think, oh, they're going to do it. No, they're going to do it. And then no one's going to do it. So the designer is a very important role, not as the owner of the design in my precious baby design, but as the person who makes sure everything is documented, everyone knows what's going on, and nothing falls through the cracks. Again, responsible for the design. So responsible for making sure that nothing is forgotten and that that dog gets fed. So part of doing the work of the design, like I said, is being able to capture ideas from other people and your team members, from your team. So it's part of communication. It's part of being an attentive listener, not cutting people off when they're talking to you, not being like, yeah, I've thought that before. I already thought that, it doesn't work. Because maybe that person thought about an angle that you didn't. Maybe that person just has a different kind of idea how to implement things that might actually work. Or maybe they just, had the same idea as you and you know it doesn't work, but listen to them, let them, and then explain to them why it might or might not work. And of course, when you're having a discussion with your team about, let's think about new ideas for this game, you need to know when to move the discussion forward. Because if you're talking about ideas and you spend 20, 30 minutes on each idea, you're not going to talk about many ideas in a day. So you need to take notes. You need to make sure people know that their ideas are being cataloged and will be referred to later. But you also need to be able to, okay, we talked a lot about this idea. Let's go to that person's idea now. Or let's continue with that other subject we needed to talk about, just in order to get the discussion flowing, right? So documentation, communication, I think is also a very big part of game design. And I don't mean writing lengthy, complex documents out of a form that you found on Google. Documentation can be a napkin with a coffee stain that you're writing in a coffee shop because you just had an idea and you don't want to forget it. Writing things down is a way to remember things. Even if something is fresh in your mind today, in 2 weeks, you'll have other things fresh on your mind and you might not remember the details of the thing that you talked about 20 minutes ago. So documentation is not to tick any boxes. It's just to make sure that people understand what's going on and and to keep that history of what you have decided so that you don't keep discussing the same things over and over. Again, with communication, it's very important to know how to adapt your language based on how people learn in your team. Some people will be more verbal and they will understand better when you write things down. People will be understanding better when you make a sketch, even it's a very crude sketch, very awful sketch. But if you show them visually, they will understand. Some people will understand better through flowcharts. So you will need to adapt and maybe explain things in several different ways just to make sure everyone understands what you're saying. It's very good to have documents to avoid miscommunications, to make sure that everyone's on the same page. Here is an example, for example, for different kinds of language for communicating something. For example, I'm talking about how the design of what happens with a door. So I can write down when a player reaches a door, they can open it or shoot it. If they open it, the door opens normally. If they shoot it, the door explodes. Or I can just draw a very simple flow chart, reach the door, action, open or shoot, door open, door explodes. One of these is very easy to just look and immediately grasp what it says. And the other, you need to think a little bit more. So adapt your language, adapt your tools to what you're trying to say. Lastly, about this, the designer is about inspiration. So it's very important to play games. Of course, like if you want to make games, you probably want to understand the language of games. You want to understand the conventions of games. And you don't necessarily need to play all the games of all the genres. You need to play the games that you're interested in making. Because for example, if you don't play any sports game and you don't really like sports games, you probably don't want to make a sports game. So focus on what you want and not necessarily on what other people think you should. But yeah, it's very important to have a strong mental library of games and how games work. But it's also very important to have like other hobbies, to do other things. Your creative output is going to be very enriched by a life well lived. Like, make games about art, make games about skydiving, make games about gardening, make games about medieval calligraphy. Just make games about things that you're excited about. Don't just make games about other games. It's very important to like use your life and your excitement as inspiration. So then you can make a game that no one's ever seen, like skydiving cats, why not? All right, so part 2, the process. So first, I'm going to talk a little bit about something that's a bit more producer territory, but I think in a small team, it might a lot of times fall to the designer, and it's very important to think about when designing. So I'm putting it here, which is, well, it's not working. Yes, project scope. So scope is basically like how much stuff is in your game, right? How many levels, how many characters, how many assets, how many weapons, how much time to beat, how many songs, how many animations, everything, like the size of your game. You could have a Pong, which is very simple in scope, or you could have a GTA 5, which is huge in scope. Probably for a hackathon, you're not going to do a GTA 5, probably unless you have many millions and a very big team and a lot of time, you're also not going to do a GTA 5. Yeah, if you're doing a 1-week hackathon, you're probably not going to develop the Oasis, but you can still develop something really cool. And when you're scoping your game, when you're thinking what you are going to be able to put in your game to develop, you need to be very wary of feature creep, which is this concept where you just keep adding things because you think more is better, or because you think this stuff is really cool, maybe we can add it. And then you just keep adding until you have something that is basically unusable, not really cool. It's much better in your game to do 3 things really well than to do 10 things that are kind of meh, you know? Focus on your strengths and focus on the strongest elements in your game. Like, you can usually find some 3 to 5 things that are the core of your game. And I'm talking about very small things. I'd like to talk a little bit about this minimum viable product. I would say, I'm just very quickly making a comparison here. If I would say in Mario Brothers, the first one, the core of that game is that you can walk, you can run, you can jump, and you can kill enemies by jumping on them. Maybe the kill enemies isn't really necessary since it's a bit of a subset of jump. It's always connected. But yeah, you can walk, you can run, you can jump, you can kill. And that's the core. If you can develop this and see if this works, you already have a very solid base. The secret when you're thinking about what is the minimum you should do to prove your game is to keep cutting things. So you cut, you think you reach the minimum that you can reach, and then you cut some more, and then you just come to a point where it's like bare bones. And that bare bones is what you should develop first. Because let's say Mario, let's say running, jumping, and jumping on enemies. If the running doesn't feel good, putting 3D on top and adding power-ups and the fire flower and water levels is not going to make it better. The running needs to be spot on. The jumping needs to be great. The feeling of jumping on an enemy and poofing it away needs to be like great. So focus on polishing these 3 things before you even add art. I would say that for a minimum viable product, don't focus on making art. Make it with squares. Make it so that the feeling is all that you see, because it's very easy to get bogged down and to not see like the basics. When you make it shiny and pretty, you kind of feel like it's good because it's pretty and you forget to look beyond that. So yeah, focus on those basics. I want to go through the heyday. This is heyday. This is my game. I've been there for 6 years. This game is 8 years old. And Heyday is a farming game on mobile. You can plant crops, you can harvest them, you can create products, you can get animals, tend to animals, sell products, you can fish, you can do a lot of stuff in this game. But if we were making it now, and I think this was where it started back then, there would be a very simple minimum viable product. It would be this. You have field, you plant, you harvest. Is planting and harvesting fun? Because if planting and harvesting is not fun, there is something fundamentally wrong with this game concept. And we need to either polish it until it's fun, or we need to scrap it and start over and try something else. If your game is heavily based on pressing buttons, then the button pressing needs to be fun. The button needs to have a quality to it that you want to press the button. Of course, like, it takes a long time maybe to get there, but once you get there, you know that the basics are good enough to build upon. When you're prototyping and testing your concepts, you want to test a very small amount of things at a time. Because if you test too many things, I put 20 things in my prototype to test and something doesn't feel right, I'll have to think about all those 20 things to find the problem. And many times it will be in the interaction between the things. So it really gets hard real fast. And if you just put 3 things and test those 3 things, and those 3 things are okay, and then you add 2 more things, and something breaks, you know that it's in one of the 2 new things. So doing this incremental adding and testing is super important. I'd rather go somewhere else now, but this is where the presentation goes, so let's go here. When designing, I would say that it's very important to go from broad to narrow. Like go from view of the world, then start going down until you get to the cells. For example, this is just a list I came up with. It's not complete, it's not even necessarily correct, but go with me here. Let's say you have an idea for a game. From this idea, you generate a proper concept, and this concept needs to reinforce that idea that you had. From the concept, you start designing the features and the mechanics. How does the game work? How does the player interact with the world? And these rules need to reinforce the concept, which needs to reinforce the idea. And then from the features and the mechanics, maybe you start designing levels, so the place where the player plays the game. These levels need to reinforce the mechanics that need to reinforce the concept. So it keeps going up. Like, you always need to consider the broad when you're going to the narrow. you always need to be refining and focusing your main thing. So like when I'm making content, when I'm making weapons or crops for heyday, or I need to think about the bigger picture always when making the small details. What else? Yeah, tools for designing, not physical tools at all, just like mental tools for designing. I would say that these are very important. Would be like brainstorming. I guess everyone knows more or less what brainstorming is. So you coming up with ideas either on your own or with other people, either by talking or by writing or by mind mapping. I find that a great way to brainstorm is talking to another person, even if it's not someone who necessarily knows what's going on in the brainstorm. Just having to explain things and trying to articulate what you're trying to do can be really strong to get the unclicking of that idea in your mind. Not unclicking, like unlocking of the idea in your mind. Also, for me, very important, because I'm a very like I like writing a lot, is documenting. When I'm writing stuff down and trying to put things in steps and trying to explain like flows of things, I often find holes. So I have this part, oh wait, I have to write this part. I completely forgot about this and it made sense in my mind, but now that I'm writing it down, I see that there is a problem there. So for me, documenting, making flow charts, making sketches, just putting it down on paper is very important. And of course, talking on putting it down on paper, you can also prototype, either digitally with an engine or a prototyping tool, or you can prototype on paper. A lot of people like make makeshift board games for their prototyping. Either they use like a pack of cards or dice to simulate mechanics, random mechanics or stuff like that. And yeah, having something that you can actually play with another person is very important, because like that reaction of how the other person feels about the thing that you have made is the most important tool that you will have as a designer, this seeing how another person plays your thing. And whenever you're brainstorming and thinking ideas and coming up with solutions, I would suggest that you always come back to the why of the issue. Like if I go way into like, oh, brainstorming, let's make this cool new feature, it's going to be really cool. Like, wait, stop. What are we trying to solve again? Because sometimes you start from point A, you're trying to get to point B, and suddenly you're out on a tangent way at point F. So recentering and coming back to where do we really want to get to is an important tool for when you're starting to get muddled and getting off on a tangent. What time is it? Yes. All right, so this is something that is said a lot in many creative areas, and it is that ideas are cheap. Even a badly implemented game is going to be better than an idea inside your head. You can't play an idea, you can't test an idea, you have to get it down and get it implemented, get it prototyped. If you have a game idea, a book idea, a movie idea inside your head for 20 years, it's pretty useless unless you do something with it. So ideas are a dime a dozen, a lot of people have them, and that's why also it's very important to be willing to kill your ideas, kill your darlings. It doesn't matter how much you believe in an idea, if it's not meshing in a game and you're trying to shoehorn it in, you're only doing a disservice both to the game and to the idea, because the game is not going to be better by forcing an idea that doesn't fit, and the idea is not going to be good if it's forced into a game where it doesn't belong. So if you have an idea that you love but it's not fitting in, save it for a future project. It's probably going to be better for you and for everyone else involved, really. So fail fast. This is said a lot in startup scene as well, like fail fast, try a lot, fail fast, fail early, something like that, which is this idea of designing something small, prototyping it, and then testing it, and then coming back and designing something else, or redesigning the thing that didn't work, and then prototyping. So going through a very quick loop, not taking a month for each prototype, I'm saying like taking a couple of days for each prototype until you get to what works. So if you follow this iteration many times, you'll probably get somewhere very good. And you don't want this to take a lot of time, because this is time that you could eventually be working on your development. So not only fail fast, I would say that you also want to fail early, because let's say this IKEA couch, right? You built this whole thing, it took you an afternoon. And when you're almost done, you realize that you forgot to add some screws way in the beginning, or that you used the wrong screws. Now, fixing this problem in your design is going to take a lot of work and a lot of time. And maybe that couch was meant to be done 2 hours ago. So you're gonna have to overshoot your deadline and overshoot your effort in order to get this done. If instead you realize early on, if you read the instructions very carefully and you design your process properly, and you decide that these screws need to go in when the couch is still just a lot of planks, then you get no extra work. You did the pre-work, and now you can just develop the whole thing. Of course, with design, it's not necessarily that simple, because sometimes things fall apart. That happens. But you really need to try to do a lot of work early in order to avoid overwork as much as possible. Rework and changing things, because another thing that changing your design later on does, besides like jeopardize your deadlines and your scope and give extra work for everyone, is it kind of undermines the trust in the team. The team gets a little bit frustrated at having to redo things, especially if it happens often. And there is a little bit of a, come on, you're supposed to be responsible for this thing, and this is happening all the time. So yeah, it undermines a lot of things in your team if you don't pay attention to the early design. Lastly, for the process, is to know when it's done. With a lot of creative endeavors, writing a book, making a movie, painting a painting, you can always keep improving it forever. You can always put an extra touch. You can always make it a little bit better. With games, it's the same thing. But perfect is the enemy of good enough, and perfect is also the enemy of done. Once your game is good enough, let it go. Do whatever you're going to do with it. If you're going to try to publish it, or if you're just going to show it to your friends, or if you're just going to put it on the internet, like, let it go. Because any extra time that you spend on this game is going to be time that you're not going to spend on your next game or on your next endeavor that might be even better. Like, you're always learning. Try to jump from project to project when it's good enough, and not try to polish it until it's perfect, because it's never going to be perfect. Nothing is perfect. All right, so part 3, the experience. Let's see. First of all, a lot of people talk about fun when they're talking about games. And I guess we come to this question of, what is fun? Fun is really elusive and hard to define, very subjective. Like, something that's fun for one person is not necessarily going to be fun for the next. Some would argue that games don't really need to be fun. They need to be engaging. But the truth is that fun is a lot easier to sell. If you make the game equivalent of an indie art house movie, you're probably going to have a lot less people playing your game. So it's going to be a lot harder to sell, because people know what fun games feel like, and they want to feel that. And people don't necessarily know what the engaging, sorrowful, very emotional game that you want to make is. So fun sells, just saying. Of course, what is fun though? Fun, very subjective. So this is from this service called Quantic Foundry. They make research into gamer motivation. They have this gamer motivation model, which is very cool. I suggest you look into it. I put it later in the resources section, so you can take it from there. They defined 6 different player motivations, each one divided into 2 categories. So this is not necessarily like, I like one of these. I am, as a gamer, am probably made of several of these, some at a higher level and some at a lower level. But it's really interesting to think of how fun can be different things for different people, and how you can make a game combining some of these aspects that can be something very interesting and very new. So this is a good jumping off point when you're thinking, what do I want to make? I want to make a game that is really strong on completion, a lot of collectibles. I also really want to focus on community, and I want a lot of explosions. So maybe you want to go there. Maybe you want to go on something else, but it's interesting to kind of like mix and match and see where you can get. This is a good jumping off point for brainstorming and for understanding who you're making your game for. Okay, so the game, when you finish your game, when you have your game, when you have any game, it's an object, it's inert, right? The game in itself is nothing. The game experience exists between the device and the person. It exists inside the person's head who's playing it. So you really need to make sure to understand how that person is playing your game, to test your game, to ask people what they think about when they're playing your game, so that you know what your game is actually doing, because what you put into the game is not necessarily what they're getting out of the game. So now I'm just going to talk about a few things that you can do in order to craft experiences for your player. Hopefully this will be useful. One of the important parts of game experiences is loops. So loops are systems that kind of like feed into themselves. There are many different kinds of loops in games. For example, this is a common one in mobile games. For example, you build, and then you battle, and then you get resources to build some more, to battle some more. So there is this cycle, like every part leads to the next. Another common loop would be like you get to a new area, you defeat enemies, you get stronger, and then you get to a new area. So you know what you're going towards. Like the player has an idea what they're striving to. They're striving to get to new areas, to get stronger, to defeat stronger enemies. Loops can be of any size, right? And a game will have many different kinds of loops. There is, for example, a loop of I hit the enemy loses health. This is a loop. The enemy hits me, I lose health. This is a small loop that you can continue until the player dies. Oh, sorry, the enemy dies. And then there is maybe the bigger loop of I kill the enemy, I get XP, I get stronger, I kill another enemy, for example. And then there is maybe more complex loops, like I kill this enemy, I get an object, I craft something with this object, and I trade this crafted thing with the other person, and then I combine this together to make something else that I will use to improve my weapon so that I can kill better enemies. So a loop doesn't have to be just 2 or 3 or however many number of steps. It can be huge, it can be tiny. There are probably many that you can identify. There are also like different loops that feed into themselves. For example, in the games, farming RPGs, Story of Seasons or Stardew Valley, you have the loop that is like, it's a farming game. You wake up, you do your thing, and then you go to bed. And then it's the next day. And then you wake up, you do your thing, you go to bed. You have this loop and you're trying to squeeze as much as you can, much value as you can inside a day before you go to bed. Eventually, when enough days have gone by, you start a new season. So now instead of spring, it's summer. So now there are new things for me. I will try to maximize my days inside the season of summer, which brings other challenges and other new exciting content, summer crops, summer events, I don't know, maybe the beach is open, that kind of stuff. And then when enough seasons have passed, you get the loop of a new year. So it all starts over again. And it's all this adaptation of what is going on right now in this day, this season, and this year. And how can I adapt my gameplay to make the best out of this moment and this loop? The thing about game loops is that they usually feed into themselves. They repeat. For example, here, you upgrade your tools in order to access a new area. And in this new area, you gather resources, and you gather these resources in order to upgrade your tools. So let's say that at some point, you can't upgrade your tools anymore. They're maxed out, right? So There's nothing you can do anymore. So basically, the player has no motivation anymore to gather resources. Why are they going to do it? There's no place to put those resources. So if your game has a loop that will be broken because you have a max level for the tools, for example, you need to think about a new place to put in those resources so that another loop is formed. For example, now you can use those resources to tame your pets or something like that. Otherwise, the player is just going to ignore that part that is not part of a loop anymore. And if you're fine with that, that's fine too. Rhythm and pacing. See, I'm a bit late already, but let's go quick. Rhythm, pacing. Usually in your game, you want to give players variety of the player experience, right? If you have a game that's just keeps on a base level, it's going to be boring. Even if it goes to max level and stays there, it's going to be boring. Nothing's changing. If all I have to do is kill enemies and the enemies just come all the time and nothing else happens, that's boring. The rhythm is just flat. Another option is to have something that goes high and then comes low, goes high and comes low in kind of like a predictable manner. And that's also a little bit boring because the player knows, oh, now that I'm done with waiting around, the enemy's going to come and then I'm going to kill them and then I'm going to wait around. Usually what you want in pacing in a game is a very variable rhythm. So you want to amp up the action and then come down a bit and then go up and then go down a lot and then kind of like keep the player guessing what's coming next. Keep the player adapting to the new situation, which is not necessarily something they've seen before. What else? Oops. Yeah, this is what I was going to say about Stardew Valley or Story of Seasons, that like these new seasons that come by in the loops, they just keep you like, when spring ends and summer starts, you kind of like have to throw away all your spring things and start anew with the summer things. So it kind of like keeps you doing new things, even though they're the same things that you did on the last summer. It's varied enough. Like on the winter, there's not a lot to do. So maybe you interact with parts of the game that you don't usually do. You do some fishing, you do some mining. And then on the spring, there's a lot to do because you have to plant all the things. So there is this cycle of, oh, spring is really busy. And then fall is less busy. Winter is really calm. And you get this variability. It's really cool. Of course, like usually when you're talking about rhythm and pacing, you're also talking about tension and amping up and putting tensions up and down. Ways to move tension in your game. I just list a few here. For example, if your game has enemies and usually you bring 3 to 5 or 10, however many enemies, change it up, bring just one for now. Like bring one really big enemy, really strong enemy, and just have the player deal with that because they're used to many enemies that are a bit weaker. Now make them deal with one that is stronger. Make them learn how to do that. Or otherwise, like just give them a lot more enemies. If you give them 5 or 7, now give them 20 and see how they do. Make them weaker, but make them a lot, give them a mob. So just like creating situations where your player has to adapt. Another thing you might do, you might restrict their access to resources. Now they don't get health kits. Now they don't get ammo. Now they don't get power-ups. How are they going to do this? They're going to have to change their gameplay so that they don't spend that last bullet on this enemy. Maybe they learn to dodge better. Maybe they learn to, maybe they just start running away instead of interacting. And that's fine because that's a challenge that you're putting in front of them that they're not used to. Another thing you might do is limit their time. Like if you say that in 30 seconds a bomb is going to go off, they're going to scramble. It's going to be really tense. So if you limit their time for some reason, they're going to run and it's going to create that feeling of tension. And also what you can do is limit their physical space or limit their access to physical elements. For example, if they're usually used to hiding behind crates and stuff, put them in a completely empty room and see what they do. If they're used to being in a wide open area, put them in a narrow corridor and make them deal with that. So like changing the environment, changing their access to things, changing the enemies that come towards them or whatever challenge it is, doesn't need to be an enemy shooty game at all. Give them less seeds, give them less animals, give them less stuff and see what they do. This is a really good way to amp up the tension. Quickly about learning the game, learning to play the game. Basically, when you're giving the player a game for the first time, you need to take it slow. Like players are not necessarily going to know your kind of game. You want to teach them. You probably don't want to give them a lot of text and tutorials. but you want to teach them through the game. So for example, let's say you have a shooting game, you have a space shooter, a shoot 'em up. You start with your spaceship, and the player can move around, move in all directions, and then you put an enemy, and this enemy only moves. You don't make them do anything else. They move. If they hit you, you get damaged, but they only move. They don't attack you. And then the player learns how to shoot. Once the players learn how to move and shoot, then you can put an enemy that also shoots. And then the player has to learn how to deal with that. Then when the player has learned how to deal with that, maybe you teach them how to use a new kind of weapon. And then they'll have to adapt their gameplay. And maybe at that point, you put a lot of enemies in the screen, and that's when you teach them how to use the bomb, which clears away the whole screen. So if you very slowly, not necessarily very slowly, but if you step by step give them challenges and only progress to the next challenge when the previous one is dealt with, they kind of learn as they're playing, which is the best way of learning a game, at least for like remembering. If you just say, do this, do this, do this, and they just follow an arrow, they're not learning, they're just repeating, and they're going to forget it immediately. But if you go this way, at least they're interacting with the game and they're seeing how the game reacts to them. Maybe after they learn the bomb, you start teaching them about enemy formations and other like more complex kind of behaviors. The thing about tutorials is that it's usually left to the end of a development cycle, and usually like not planned for. So it's a bit left to the end. There is no more time, no more money, no more nothing, and then people just scramble to get a tutorial in there. So if you want to leave it to the end, plan for it to be at the end so that you can make a good tutorial or a good first level at the end, and not just scramble something together and make something kind of not great. Because you have to remember, the first thing that the player sees in your game needs to be fun. Because if you give them 5 minutes of boring, they're going to quit your game and go to another game. There are other games, there are many games in the world. Like playing a boring game is not something many people will do just because what if it gets better? Also about learning, oh no, I'm going super off time right now. About learning as well. You have to be careful when you're teaching patterns to your player. I'm just going to go through a bit of Pokemon examples when players are learning what is strong against what. With Pokemon in the beginning, it's very easy. There's water, there's fire, there's grass. You know intuitively that water is strong against fire because water extinguishes fire. You also know that fire burns plants, so fire burns grass. The grass being strong against water is a bit murkier, though if you think on the opposite, that water feeds grass, it would make sense that water is weak against grass and grass is strong against water. But then you go a bit further and then you get to, for example, fighting, ghosts, and psychic. If you already know, like I know, that fighting does no damage to ghost, ghost is strong against psychic, and psychic is strong against fighting, you might come up with a narrative like, okay, you can't punch a ghost. So of course, fighting does no damage to a ghost. Ghost and psychic, well, psychic's basically the mind feels fear, ghost is frightening, so ghost is strong against psychic. You might think something like that. And psychic is fighting, brains against brawn, like pen's mightier than the sword, all that kind of narrative. But then you go into more obscure things like bug, fairy, and dark. Who is strong against who? You can't intuit. Like there is no logic in your way out of this problem. You have to learn it. And some things the players will just learn. You have to, you trust that your players will learn your patterns. I still don't know, like 24 years of playing Pokemon, I don't know this out of the top of my head, though Dark and Fairy are new types. But anyway, the thing about patterns is that the players want to know what's going on. For example, in a dungeon crawler, like Diablo or a lot of times, at least for me, the fun is in exploring the whole level. And if there are 2 paths, I will pick the one that I think is not the correct path that goes to the end. I just want to go to the path to get all the treasure. And if I get to the end of that path and that was the exit path, I'll get really pissed off and go back and do the other path. So if you have ways to teach your player which path goes where, they will learn this and they will adapt their play and use their time better. Another thing, for example, is the pattern of having save points before dangerous areas in a game. So for example, if you have a boss fight, you put that little automatic loading saving before that, the players will notice that, oof, it's saving, something is coming, I better get prepared. So players notice these patterns, and you really need to be consistent, because in game design, it's not really about realism, it's all about consistency. If you think about it, in most games where you can jump, the jump is not a realistic height at all. Like you can jump way high. But what it needs to be is to be consistent with the challenges in your game. So if you have a ledge, you know you can jump it. If you have a ledge that you can't jump, but you know that you can push a box, you know that you can push the box and jump it. If you have a ledge that is too high, you need to know that it's not high enough to jump with the box. But if it's high enough, you might intuit that you might actually eventually learn to double jump. So all these patterns are things that the player realizes if you're consistent. You want to make these changes, these differences between, for example, ledge heights, very noticeable, so that it's not just a little difference that the player always has to check if that's the correct ledge or not. You want them to learn and to feel smart for knowing. What else? Last part of experience, user experience. You can make a game as niche as you want. Let's say you make a game that you know that only 5 people in the world are going to want to play. You want to make it so that all those 5 people can play your game, that you have no obstacles that those 5 people cannot surpass for other reasons that are not the game is too hard or like things that they need to research about your game. For example, this comes into accessibility, right? If you have blinking lights in your game, that might be really disturbing for people who have sensitivities, visual sensitivities, of people who have epilepsy, for example, have visual like stimuli is a problem to them. So you need to think about these things. They're not necessarily going to be quick solutions. And as a small team, you're not necessarily going to be able to fix them easily, but keep them in mind, because the earlier you think about these things, just like tutorials, the earlier you think about how are you going to do this, the easier it's going to be to implement them if you can. So another thing is audio only cues. Some people are hard of hearing. Some people play only when their friend is watching TV. Some people always play with the sound off. Some people are always listening to podcasts when they're playing. So if you put some cues that are only accessible via audio, a lot of players are not going to be able to interact with that. Another thing is colors. A lot of people are colorblind. If you make a puzzle matching game, like a match 3, and you only rely on colors, you're gonna cut away that portion of the population. They just can't play your game. Another thing is subtitles. Sometimes subtitles are teeny tiny when you look at them on a TV, and you just can't read them, and you can't understand what people are saying, either because you can't, or because you're hard of hearing, or because English is not your first language, or whatever language is not your first language, and then you really want to help them play your game. So put some subtitles and let them make the sizes bigger or smaller. Another thing is the camera. Camera is a funny thing, because like some people love normal camera, like up, down, left, right. Some people love inverted camera, so if you put up, it goes down, and vice versa. Some people get nauseated when they play games with cameras that move too fast. So be mindful that, like, give options to players with camera. Another thing, the last here, is inputs. If you make a game with really confusing inputs that needs very specific controllers, that needs to press 100 different buttons at the same time, people are not necessarily going to be able to play them. So be mindful, try to make your game as simple as possible. So coming to the end, I was going to talk about this, but it's just about an audio only cue that exists in Animal Crossing, and I always miss it, because this shooting star, you can only see it if you listen to the sound, and I never listen because it's too low. Anyway, so coming to the end, the parts are over, now it's just end. Know your genre. I can't tell you how to do your game, because there are many genres of games. The details, it's going to be you. Whatever you do, like, don't just copy genre conventions because they're conventions. You have to ask yourself why they did it that way, and why that way would help you and your game. Know your genre, but don't be afraid to shy away from the conventions. Here are some takeaways. Like, it's a lot of text. It's most text I have in this thing, I guess. So as a designer, do your best to communicate clearly and to take in other people's ideas and feedback into account. but remember that you own that design task. Also, focus into breaking your project into small chunks and prioritizing those chunks. Don't let the content and the polish get in the way early on, and always reevaluate your concept and your ideas. And also keep in mind how the game experience feels for the player. Is it a good rhythm? Is there a good sense of progression? How can you teach the player your systems? How can you help as many players as possible experience your game? And then just a few resources if you want to look at them. Some very good YouTube channels and Quantic Foundry, who does the gamer motivation model. And yeah, that's it. Sorry for going over time, but I will be mentoring on Discord, so.
Camilla, that was really interesting. I don't know if anyone has questions. You can post them in the chat. But on my side, you've been responding every question that came up. So yeah, thank you.
Thanks.
Maybe something I'd like to ask you is how do you deal with how would you advise to deal with the budget issue if you want to make a game, but you probably don't have enough money to make like you said, like a GTA? How do you deal with convincing people to be a part of your team, convincing people to give you money to work on this game, or maybe change game ideas? I don't know. How would you deal with that?
Yeah, I think you need to start small. I mean, you can't do your first game be an MMO or be GTA. Like, you really need to learn your stuff and to slowly get like better and better until you get to that point. And convincing people to work on your game, if it's a hobby project, it really is about getting other passionate people. If it's a company, then yeah, you probably need to pay them some money.
Thank you. Someone, and I can't pronounce his name, VXDCXYW, is asking, when you have multiple working MVP, how do you cut off to select the best one?
When you have multiple ones.
Mm-hmm.
Well, if you have multiple ones, I would say, well, you mean multiple different games that you made MVPs for, or like multiple systems inside the same game?
I'm not sure. Maybe can you precise your different games?
Okay. Well, I would say show people and see what people get the most excited about, especially like find people who are interested in the games you're trying to make and show it to them and see which one garners the most interest.
Another question is, Bruno, what tips can you give to a team that is making a game for the first time?
I would say keep it small. Like, having a game that is done is better than having an ambitious idea that you never are able to complete, right? It's better to make a Pong than to aim for a Mario Brothers and not to get there, because like every game is a step for the next game. So don't be afraid of doing something small.
I have another question. When you want to test your game, so you're not waiting until it's perfect, but how do you decide the time has come to show it to people? Like, can you show a sketch, or do you like work more on the prototype before showing it to users or players?
I guess it depends who you're showing it to. Of course, you don't want to like burn everyone in your circle, like with the first idea before you want to show it to a small number of people. And yeah, you can show the very early thing and just like explain the game using a pen, maybe.
Yeah.
That's fine. But then don't show it to everyone.
Yeah, okay.
So show this to this group, and then the next thing you show to a little bigger group and go like bigger and bigger every time.
Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome.
Any other question? Well, I think people can still reach you in the Discord chat. And we don't have any question now. I think you've answered a lot. So thank you very much, Camilla.
You're welcome.
And thank you everyone for being here. The talk will be replayed. You can find the link in the planning. And yeah, I hope everyone have a nice evening or day. Thank you, everyone.
You guys have a good hackathon.
Thank you. Bye bye.